a graphite pencil, an X-Acto knife, extra blades, a kneaded eraser, a ruler, spray adhesive, and a cutting mat. Once you have completed sets 1 through 4, the first step is to carefully cut out each of the 48 compositions, if you haven't already done so. Take your time with this, especially when cutting the circular compositions. Crooked or jagged edges will be more noticeable when the compositions are mounted on either gray illustration/mat board or gray construction paper. After cutting out each composition, pick the best example for each of the 12 concepts. You do not have to select an equal number of compositions from each of the 4 sets. For example, you may choose 1 composition from set 1 and 4 compositions from set 3. Just make sure that you choose the strongest conceptually and the most creative visually to display on the presentation board. The next step is to type the 12 corresponding labels. Each label should contain the composition number and the concept illustrated. For example, number 4, asymmetry. Make sure you use a font that is simple, clear, and easy to read. Sans serif typefaces, such as Arial, Calibri, and Helvetica, are excellent choices. Definitely avoid using decorative script fonts, such as Brush Script, Lucida Calligraphy, and others. These are more difficult to read and will distract from the 12 compositions. And absolutely never use Comic Sans or Papyrus. There is nothing even remotely close to pushing boundaries with these fonts. They're really overused and frankly, pretty ugly. Also, be sure to use an appropriate font size. Your labels shouldn't be monstrously large, but they also shouldn't be tiny and difficult to read. Keep in mind that you will also need a 13th label for your name and group name. Make sure you space labels out when typing so that when printed, there will be enough negative space to cut around them. Use a straight edge to cut labels so that they are neat and have square corners. You may eyeball or estimate the measurements, like I am doing here, or actually use your ruler to measure and mark the height for each row of labels. Regardless of what approach you take, just make sure that all labels have the same height and are consistent in shape. When cutting the labels, do not cut too close to the text. You should leave some space around it so it doesn't feel cramped. And at the same time, make sure you don't leave too much space. Once your labels are typed and cut, take the strongest 12 compositions and lay them out on a sheet of gray illustration or mat board. Take time to really play around with the compositions. You want to think about the whole board as a single large composition that should be visually balanced. There needs to be negative space between compositions, but you must also avoid creating large areas of unused or awkward negative space. The overall space should be activated evenly throughout the composition. The placement of the 12 compositions should be deliberate with the same degree of complexity throughout. For example, in this poorly put together presentation board, there is more unity on the left side, created through the stacked horizontal rectangles, while there is more variety on the lower right side, where the circles are positioned. The distribution of simple and complex shapes is uneven, creating a slightly disunified composition. As you play around with the compositions, remember that there should be at least 2 inches of space between them and more where labels will be placed. Compositions can be arranged in a variety of ways, in 3 rows of 4, in 2 rows of 6, or in 4 rows of 3. This board will be oriented vertically, but do keep in mind that the presentation board could also be positioned horizontally or even be cut to create a square format. Here, the circular compositions are evenly dispersed, so there is the same level of complexity throughout the entire picture plane. Once you have roughly finalized the placement of each composition, you are now ready to measure the borders. Make sure that you allow at least 2.5 inches of space between compositions and the edge of the board so that a visual border is created. The bottom edge should have slightly more space so that the composition as a whole does not feel weighted down. Since the 3 compositions in each row seem to visually fit within the width of the board, I know that I will not have to trim one of the edges. Start in the top left corner and measure 2.5 inches along the left and right edges of the board. For the purposes of this demo, I am using ink to mark each measurement, but you should always use a pencil and draw very lightly on the board so that every single mark or line can be completely erased after everything has been mounted. Next, find the measurements for the left and right borders by measuring along the top border. You will also need to measure halfway down so that you are able to successfully line up your ruler with more than one tick mark when you are ready to draw a line to establish the vertical borders. Line up your ruler with the tick marks on the left and right edge and draw a line across the board. This establishes the top border. Do the same for the left border, using the tick mark in the center to guide your ruler. After you do the same for the right border, you will want to extend those lines to the bottom of the board. Mark those measurements and complete the lines that establish the left and right borders. You will want to wait until the end to measure the bottom border because at this point you are unsure as to whether or not you will need to trim the board. Next, line up the first composition at the top left corner and mark the placement of the bottom right corner. This mark will be especially helpful when you glue down this composition later on in the process. Next, line up the third composition at the top right corner and do the same. Finally, center the second composition, either eyeballing its placement or measuring the width of the top border and finding its center to help you better align it. You could also measure the width of the composition and lightly mark its center to even more accurately position it in the middle of the board. If you do decide to do this, make sure that you fully erase that mark after everything has been glued down.